sometimes human, sometimes animal, all conceived with extraordinary imagination and a wealth of expressive detail.
Live more natural lives in their unnatural habitats.
Becoming aware of nature, of natural details, and so forth.
But whenever he can, he has to be ready to investigate the unexpected and unusual, because it may contribute to what he wants to know.
We're talking about the sorts of things that had an impact in as much as they came from one part of the world and journeyed to another and acted in the mode of impact, impulse, influence, and so on.
We want to him the man at the wheel, who hurls the lance of his spirit across the earth along the circle of its orbit.
I'd suggest that we should rather look for changing angles of vision.
An inventive tradition which was able to handle with considerable equanimity a long list of wonders.
Welcome back to another episode of Administrism. I'm really excited about this episode because this culture that we went over was really exciting, at least to me, when Pythia and I had kind of a discussion about their spiritual beliefs, and yeah, we'll get more into that in a minute. But so, for those who don't know, this episode we will be talking about the Hoansi, which, before we get into that, I will reiterate that I will more than likely be pronouncing a lot of these wrong, because this language is part of the Hoan language branch, and they are world-renowned for the difficulty of Westerners to pronounce their words and phonemes and things like that. They have 4 clicking sounds. They are the dental click, which sounds like; the alveolar click, which sounds like; the alveolo-palatal click, which sounds like; and then the lateral click, which sounds like. And those are all used in a lot of their words, and for Westerners it is kind of difficult to tell the difference, and putting them together as phonemes is a little bit tricky for us. And on top of that, it is also tonal language as well. So it's from my perspective, it's pretty fucking difficult, but I'm going to try my best to preserve how things are pronounced as best I can. But just so you know, it's probably a little wrong, and I'm going off of how it's written down and everything. But yeah, so the name of this group, which is, as I had said, is the Hoansi, and it is they are a San group of people, which is, they are located in Botswana, Namibia. They were very heavily studied from the 20s through the 80s. There was a lot of anthropological study that went through and studied them, because they were, up until the late 70s, early 80s, and into the 90s, they were still very heavily hunter-gatherer society, or a foraging society. Because of that, there was a lot of misconception and things like that. There was a movie that was put out in the 1980s. What was it called again?
The Gods Must Be Crazy. Everyone that was alive at that time saw that movie. Yeah.
And it was it took one of the Hoansi people, and it was very much a caricature of them. It wasn't anthropologically well done at all, and it's gotten a lot of criticism for that since, but at the time it was released, it was really popular. But yeah, so with these people, they were studied around the Dobe area in south of the Kalahari Desert. And a lot of our research comes from an anthropologist named Richard B. Lee, who works out of the University of Ontario. And I had studied these people when I had studied anthropology in school, and I know several other anthropologists who, the minute we had mentioned these people, they were like, oh, yeah, okay, you're going with them. They're very well known because Richard Lee himself kind of helped shift the anthropological paradigm as far as ethnographies go and how things are approached. But they're a very interesting people and had been living the ways of foraging and hunter-gathering for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it wasn't until their slow integration over the last couple hundred years with other local groups, and over the last couple decades, that they started slowly transitioning from the foraging society into more of a pastoral kind of mode of life. And that was usually through working on farms of other local groups.
And also the removal of their territories. They preferred to stay in their traditional format, but governments took their lands away once again.
Yep. And it wasn't just the governments either. Like, what the government did was they basically passed like a national law where in order to go hunting, you had to have a license. And in order to get that license, you had to pay money. And like, this is a foraging society. They don't really use money. So like, it was prohibitively expensive for them to do it and continue their way of life. And so they just had to start doing something else, and like their land was taken by those local groups or that they were kind of assimilating with for grazing pastures for their cattle and their other livestock. So like they were just like slowly, I wouldn't say that they were like actively gone after, right? They were just kind of like an afterthought.
Yeah.
It was like, we're just slowly moving out, and like our sheep need these lands. There are people living on it. So what? Just like stay out of here. And then the government was just like, oh, well, they hunt. Well, they're going to need to pay money then. I don't think like there was active work to, like with a lot of other indigenous groups, to like, you know, exterminate them. There wasn't like an active thing to do it. It's just like their way of life was held in sort of a negative view, and like, well, they're behind the times. They need to get over it.
Now, there was a point in time where the diamond mines did take a swing at their existence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So think about that when you look at jewelry.
Right. But as far as their way of life, as said, they were foragers, but they also lived a very like nomadic lifestyle. And so they stuck in the area of like Botswana, Namibia, but they moved depending on the season and depending on like what food sources were available. And so like how they would do things is they would set up a camp, and a camp usually consisted of around like 25 to 50 people. That's about how big these temporary settlements were that they had. And they would set up camp wherever food sources were. And so if this area had lots of mongongo nuts and trees, like that's where they would camp until like they were mostly exhausted that food source for a while, and then they would move on. And it also depended on like not only what food sources were available, but also like the temperature and everything. So like during October, September, that's when it's really hot in the Kalahari Desert. So they're not going to want to move a whole lot. It's an oppressive heat, and you don't want to spend too much time working out and doing that. They did spend a lot of time hunting too, but as Richard Lee points out in his ethnography, this group only spent around like 20 hours a week working, right? They went out, they would gather as many nuts and roots and plants as they could for food, and then they would bring them back to camp, and then they would subside on that. Or if they went hunting, the hunters used poison arrows, and so like they'd go out, and if they hit an animal, they'd hit it, and they knew that like with a bigger animal it'd take 12 hours for the poison to take them down. So after they hit it, they just went home and then went back the next day. So they didn't spend all day out hunting. There was a lot of downtime for them. And that was one of the reasons why they liked their lifestyle. They liked how they lived because, as it was expressed in the book, they knew they didn't have to work all that much. They knew that they didn't have to spend all day doing labor-intensive tasks in order to get by. Like, they knew that the land provided for them and that they could do what they want the rest of the time.
They say, why would we work if we have mongongo nuts?
Yeah, right. Like that was with the nuts and like what they were able to forage. That amounted to like 70 to 80% of their diet. Like 70 to 80% of their diet was was completely vegetarian. However, like, yeah, they did eat meat, but that was like a special thing for them. When it came to meat and everything and the distribution of it, that was a really good example of the communal nature of that group, their egalitarianism. There are several practices that they had in order to keep things as equal as possible. So whenever someone went out hunting, it was a practice for other members of the group that didn't go out hunting, or everyone else to be the ones who like supplied their poison arrows. And so when, say, Pythia was to be the one to go out hunting, I would give her poison arrows and be like, hey, when you take something down, remember whose arrows have brought it down. And so when they did that and then the meat was brought back, it was like, well, it wasn't really me who killed it. It was the poison arrows that were given to me. And so a big portion of the food has to go to this person because they provided the arrows, clearly. Like, it wasn't me. And on top of that, they had the practice of insulting the meat.
Yeah, the shaming of the meat.
The shaming of the meat, in which anything that was brought back, it was always downplayed, however much it was. So I would say, or you would ask, how much meat did you bring in? And I was, oh, it's just a paltry sum. Like, really, it wasn't even worth going out today to get that much. And it could have been like a whole big ass wildebeest. But the reason this was done was for the egalitarian thing, right? Like, the minute someone starts saying that they're the one who brought in all this meat and everything, like, they start getting a big head about them and they start getting arrogant. And because of that arrogance, you're going to, overestimate how much worth you are to the rest of the group. So it like helps keep your ego in check. Everyone else would do the same thing. Like, there was like this joking community thing with like, they would make fun of how much you brought back. There were a lot of checks and balances with the relationship to things like that with other people in the camp in order to make sure, everyone understood how much was done for everyone else. It was a very, very egalitarian organization of people and group of people. And that went down to like gender roles too, right? There are very few like prescribed gender roles to people when it comes to like the healing dances and their ritual, which that was their primary ritual, and we'll get into that in a minute. But most of the time, the men were the ones who danced and did the healing things, while the women were the ones who provided the rhythm and the singing.
They provided not just that. In doing that, they provided the energy for the healers to do the healing.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, there was that, but, like, as far as most Western concepts of, hunter-gatherer societies, it's like, men go out and do the hunting, women stay home and do the gathering. No, like, men did gathering, too. They tended to gather less than the women, but the work was still shared, and the women would hunt. Everyone had the same things to do. You understood that you were taking care of everyone else, and that's one of the things that would keep you in the group. So there are things that would cause conflict, and laziness and not wanting to contribute was one of those things. And conflict resolution kind of had 3 stages, right? Like, first of all, they would joke around with you, and they'd just be like, look at you, you're actually doing work, you lazy piece of shit. Which, by doing so, would probably want you to, work a little bit harder, so they wouldn't do that. The next step was an actual fight. Like, you could get into a fight. Typically, when it came to that, there would, other people would try and break. Or they would encourage it. They're like, no, beat his ass, he's not fucking working. And then from there, there was the potential of fatal fighting where, poison arrows were brought out. And things didn't usually get that far. But if they did, it happened, and they understood, when and why people die. But most of the time, if there was conflict and you couldn't settle it reasonably, one of the people and, their immediate family would just leave the group and go to another group, just another camp.
And usually that fatal type of fighting would have to do with bride acquisition, which is also an interesting thing in their group.
Yeah.
And almost solely a male thing was the murder aspect in their culture. And it was always between 2 men, almost always between 2 men. unless it became an eye for an eye situation, and then you would have a rash of murders break out.
Yeah. And that was incredibly rare. But I think there was a list in the group on, right in here, there's a list of between 1922 and 1955. Poison arrow fights occurred somewhere in the Dobe or Nye regions on the average of once every 2 years. The questioning succeeded in turning up 22 cases of homicide and 15 woundings during the period of 1920 to 1955. So
yeah, it's a pretty low rate.
Yeah. And with the bride acquisition, there was it was egalitarian, yes, because women still did have power, but the entire bride acquisition thing was based on the marriage by capture thing. It's really interesting how their partnership was set up, because first of all, they only the Hoansi only have 25 different names. People are typically named after ancestors and your grandparents or your great uncle or something like that. They didn't despite the relations, if that person had the same, if my prospective wife had the same name as my sister, no, that's gross. I would never marry my sister, so I can't marry that person. Or say, a woman's prospective partner was shared the same name as her grandfather. No, that's gross. I would never marry my grandfather. So it was, prospective partners were very particularly chosen out, and but because of that, there could be any excuse for why these people wouldn't marry.
On top of that, sticking to the marriage situation, their marriage fails at 50%, about 50% divorce rate on the first night.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you don't get to pick your first spouse, but you can nullify the marriage the night of the marriage and then do whatever you want after that. So it does, on paper, look like the women don't have agency in who their husbands are, but the woman can nullify the marriage on the first night, and then she's a free agent after that.
Yep. And sometimes they would give it a few weeks. Maybe the woman would live with her new husband for a couple weeks and then slowly warm up to him. But generally, she was the one who had the last word. The ritual essentially, or the ceremony, was essentially the woman would be picked up and taken to her new husband, kicking and screaming, and then they put her in a little hut. Okay, here's your husband, enjoy. And it'd take either a day or a couple weeks. And during that time period, if she was still no, fuck this guy, I hate this guy, eventually, she had the final say of, no, I'm not going to do it. And so they wouldn't push. So, like you said, on paper, it seemed like the woman had no say in it, but ultimately, she did.
And the divorce thing is so much a part of their tradition that even if it is her boyfriend and someone she's been having sex with for most of her life, it is such a tradition to get divorced that she probably will divorce him, even though she loves him.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a very funny thing to think about.
Yep. And I think there was one point in there where it said that after that first marriage, or even in a first marriage, if it lasted longer than 6 or 7 years, more than likely they were basically paired for life.
Yeah.
There are a lot of interesting practices, which we can segue that into their religious practices, which are fascinating to me.
I want to go back on to something that we do think about in anthropology and what gets misused in anthropology. And the magongo nuts, their diet, their health outcomes, they have very great health outcomes in their traditional lifestyle. I want people to understand that magongo nuts are a euphorbia, and if you tried to eat the vegetables that they ate, you will probably curl into the fetal position for the next few days. They've been living in this location for so long that they have adaptations to those plants. The same thing goes for a group called the Hadza, which was studied for dietary health. And there was a bunch of conclusions made about their diet to apply to other people's diets that just don't work because you're not Hadza. you're not Kung. It's not your lifestyle. And I know I've said this before. I'm reiterating. They've adapted to this, and that is theirs. You can't have it. You just can't.
Yeah. Well, and that's even practiced among this group too, because it was mentioned that when there are lists of foods, some of them more desirable than others, and with some of those foods, like they were specifically meant for older people, younger people in the group, it was told by their elders that it wasn't good for them to eat ostrich eggs. And so like ostrich eggs would be reserved for older people. And there was this adaptation thing that was given to them. So like there were like age specific foods.
Yeah, and also another interesting cultural aspect to them is their sex norms are very different from ours. To the point that if we were to talk about it, we probably couldn't post our shows.
Yeah. Yeah. And the approach that they have to gender, like, because everything is shared and everything, that you are who you are, so they don't really care about gender roles or whatever. They saw things as like, well, if this person wants to stay home and take care of elders and everything, like that's because of their warm heart. That's why they want to do it. It's not because, oh, they're acting in a more feminine role. No, that's just who they are. That's what they want to be.
Yeah, and if they were homosexual, it wouldn't really matter in that context to them. They're like, oh, they just prefer the company of their own sex, because homosexuality would be practiced in their earlier years as a way of finding their place within their society. So it doesn't have the same kind of kink and shame and cultural markers that it would for us.
Mm-hmm. And amongst, like, going back to another, like, really interesting practice that I found with them that I really enjoyed was with their egalitarianism and, like, sharing everything. There's the practice of haro, and haro is it's a gift-giving kind of ceremonial thing, right? And because there are multiple camps, like I said, most camps are between like 25 and 50 people, but these camps of 25 to 50 people were usually like centered around a group of siblings and their more immediate relationships or friends or whatever. But like you would know people from, you know, the camp over the hill or whatever. And periodically, like there would be trips back and forth, and just for visiting, they loved visiting each other, and they would practice haro. And haro, like I would give a gift to, say, you know, my cousin over the hill, and it could be anything. It could be just, you know, like pots or jewelry or digging sticks or whatever, and I would just give that to him. And then like I would expect months later that he would give me something. And so like that's how, if there was ever a conflict or anything, you would go to the next the next camp over, because you were constantly visiting and they knew you just as well as you knew them. And like you could go live with them, hang out for a while if there was a conflict, and go back. But you were always giving people gifts, and there was no like this. If I were to give Pythia a digging stick 1 month, if she were to come back and like give me, you know, I found this neat rock. Like it's not as useful as the digging stick, but I found this neat rock and gave it to you. Thanks. Like that would complete the ceremony, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's the exchange and not the value of the item.
Right. And yeah, I thought that was interesting, especially because like recently my wife Zarina was wanting to like start a very similar thing with our group of friends, where she like gets these things and just, hey, here you go. Like I don't expect anything back anytime soon, but I just want you to know, like, if you have this, like we make casserole or something, like with a casserole dish, it's yours to keep. But maybe later, if you want to make something and give me like a pie pan later, that'd be great.
Yeah, we kind of do this already when we do have get-togethers where everybody just lays their crap out on the table.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And like later when I come and visit you, I might bring your thing back or give you something else in exchange.
Yeah.
But yeah, so going with further practices and their religious beliefs, it's interesting. I love their spiritual beliefs. They're fantastic because, as I explained towards the beginning, Pythia and I were like, why the fuck did none of these books really talk a whole lot about their religious beliefs? Well, there's a reason. Because basically all of their religious beliefs exist around fuck you, God. Like there are basically two kinds of spirits, right? There are the gods, which there's basically a big god and a little god. And within some groups, the big god and the little god are the exact same person. And the little god is sometimes the trickster god, but sometimes the big god is also the trickster god. Like, they're both just as capricious and have their own desires and whatever as anyone else does. And then you have the dead, which are the Gangwasi. And the Gangwasi, those are the spirits of the dead, which sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. But their entire religious beliefs are basically like, we're alive, our group of people are alive, and the spirits, like the spirits of the dead and the gods, are doing whatever they can to fuck with us. Like, they're making us sick. Or they're doing these things to, like, give us bad fortune and shit like that. So us living people, we participate in these healing dances as kind of like no, we're giving power to ourselves because everyone else is a dick. That's why, like, their religious beliefs, they don't, like, there are no, like, sacrifices to the gods. There are no priests. There's no really, like, I want to learn more about this deity, or I want to learn more about his likes and dislikes, because he's kind of an asshole and he's trying to make my people sick. And anything bad that happens to us, it's their fault. Why would I want to learn more about him? The healing dances are their way of taking agency against the spiritual world, and this is what keeps their beliefs going. The structure of the healing dances. So with the healing dances, this is basically their only ritual, their only spiritual practice. Everyone is involved with it. They believe that everyone participating, or anyone who wants to participate, has the right and or duty to be able to do these things because of the egalitarian nature of everything. It's like, we don't have special healing people unless they have, like, a proclivity or, like, a talent for it, because it's a good thing for all of us to know how to do it, because it helps everyone else out. So young people are encouraged to be like, hey, you should try and learn how to do this thing so you can help us all out. So the structure of it would happen a couple times a week or more frequently, because on top of it being a ritual for healing and whatever, like, it was also an entertainment thing.
They would also always do it during the new moon, and that is actually adaptive, and I'll explain more later.
Yeah, but yeah, it's an entertainment thing. So, like, they would do it, yes, during the new moon, but also because, like, hey, we've got all of our food. There's nothing else for us to do. You want to just do a dance tonight? Hell yeah, that sounds fun. It wasn't something that was separated as being a sacred thing that no one else could participate in. They would even do them just for the entertainment of visitors, too. How it was done is, starting at around nightfall, the women of the group would build this big ass fire in the middle of the camp, and they would start singing and drumming, which drums were introduced to them, but they didn't really use drums. Like, it was mostly like clapping and like tapping on yourself and whatever. They would start it up, and then the men of the group would start dancing to it. And while they were dancing, they would get into an ecstatic state, and they believed that there was a thing that lived inside of you. What was it called? It was the Noom. And the Noom was, according to them, it's a substance that lives in the pit of your stomach of men and women who are the owners of the Noom, and it becomes active during healing dance, which it reminds me a lot of the the Azande people. And the Azande people, who were also located in Africa, believe that their magical powers or witchcraft comes from a substance that lives inside of your stomach, which I found that as an interesting correlation. With the gnome, during this dance, it would start boiling, and it would start working itself up out of your body and climb up your spine until it like erupts out of your skin. And your sweat during this dance contained that gnome, and so you would take it like during the ecstatic dance while you were, or like once you reached its peak and you got covered in sweat, you would then go to the other people who were in other fires that were around the big one, just kind of like hanging out or resting or socializing, and you would just like wipe your sweat on them in order to provide your gnome or your magic and healing to them. And like that would then work through their body in order to help them. And then after that was done, the dancers would rest, or they would take that gnome while still in their ecstatic state and then like go to these other people and like pull out these invisible arrows of like that all of the spirits of the dead or the gods had been casting into them to cause sickness. And then they would go and take these arrows and then like boil them using the gnome inside of their body, and they would fight and break these arrows, or they would take the arrows and go out to the edge of camp at nighttime where they believed that the spirits of the dead or the gods were, and they would just start yelling at them and being like, fuck off, take your shit and get out of here, you're hurting our people, go away. Or they would bargain with them and be like, hey, what can we do to make sure that you leave these people alone? The ritual was like, again, an entire thing that was built around like that bond of the living against the spirits and everything else. And at the end of, I think each dance was about an hour or two, and then there was a rest period. And then it would just go on. More people would come up to dance and then do that thing. And once they were done, once they were tired and done, like they would kind of go through shifts.
Yes, and they also believe that other people have their own they believe that there's the white man's and the Bantu and that they could use any of those. They preferred to use their own, and at the time that this study was written out, our own medical science and what we could take into the field had about the same success rate as just wait and see. So to them, all of our powers looked about on the same level at that time.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes they believe like, hey, with this instance, this other person's healing will help with ours. Like, we're not. One of the examples they gave was there was one person whose foot was caught in a bear trap. So the anthropologist, Richard Lee, came and helped wrap the bandage and everything, because they didn't have a healing dance at that time because he was like out in the field and whatever. And so like at that time, that the white man's healing helped just as well. And so we would use that depending on the situation. And then coming back, like that person's still kind of sick, and so then they would use their own.
Also, a little more on the, how do I say it? Guasi. I can't even get that click out. It's the cheat click. I can't do it. Guasi. That could be an animal spirit. That could be the spirit of the dead. They could be malevolent. They could be beneficent. But what I found interesting was the way they appeared to people. So when they would go into trance and see them, they may appear as a solid person. They may appear as a floating person or a column of smoke, which is actually how I have seen things before, which would just be the smoke entity hanging around. And I think that might be an interesting place to put your mind when you're dealing with things that might not be material in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was another thing that I hadn't mentioned. When they go in these trance states, when they go into these trance states, they say that they are able to see the spirits of the dead, and along with that, they're able to see these invisible arrows that are cast on them. But they also describe that going into this trance state is very painful. This is one thing where, like, not everyone who is part of the camp or group decides to move on and continue to be like a full-time healer kind of thing, because they understand that it's a painful process, and it's not one that is for everyone. It was described as, or the pain of going through this dance and the pain that you inevitably come across was described as, hitting the wall when you're running, right? That's what it's described as.
And I relate to that a lot. That's the 16-mile mark in a marathon. Somewhere between 16 and 18 is where you usually encounter this. And one thing that I think is interesting about it is if you push through in either one of these situations, you finish the process. And if you've done athletics, then you can probably do this kind of work.
Yeah. And if you can't, or amongst these people, if you don't want to hit that wall, you don't have to. You can still be a dancer. You can still do whatever, you want to, because those are treated equally. They don't see it as this person's coming up and dancing and they're not willing to, push through to this trance state. So get them the fuck out of here. They're like, no, it's perfectly fine. They want to dance. They can have a good time. That's what they want to do.
Yeah. The dances, they have a few dance rituals. One of them being, what's the bovine they hunt? The eland dance. And that one is one of their long-standing traditions. But they also have the giraffe dance, which, from what he says, wasn't 100 years old at the time of him writing this book. So it's barely over 100 years old now. So they are a living and changing group, just like any other group. And that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at these groups that are portrayed as primitive. They are adapting with their times, taking on new information and new spiritual practices as they go.
Mm-hmm. I think at the time of the writing, when that giraffe dance was oh no, it wasn't the giraffe dance. It was another one, the women's drum dance. In the women's drum dance, the roles were reversed, right? And so the men would be the one to start doing the singing and everything, while the women were the ones who became the healers or went into that trance state. And that one had been dated back to 1967 or something. It was right before that. It was during the 1950s when it was done, and the author of this book actually interviewed the woman who came up with the dance in 1964.
So yeah, they aren't a people in a bubble. They are adapting and moving around their ecosystem as it changes.
Mm-hmm. And then there was another paper that we had read where it describes, the art that was done on the paleoglyphs or the lithoglyphs, where the rock paintings and everything from thousands of years ago of these groups of people, and they portrayed essentially what they were experiencing in these ecstatic states. And so we know that for thousands of years they've been doing this exact same thing. It's been changing and it's been evolving, but they've had this same kind of spiritual practice or spiritual system for thousands of years.
So some stuff I want to touch on that should have been touched on earlier, but I didn't open my mouth. Their creator trickster is the mantis. And so when they encounter a mantis in the bush, they use cues from that for their hunting, and all of their non-healing dance stuff has to do around hunting. That goes back to the moon as being part of the hunt, and the sun and the stars. All of this has to do with food acquisition when it's not involved in the healing process, which I think is very interesting. There's a few other things around that, their rituals that have to do with coming of age and stuff like that. Richard didn't get too deep into that. I'm not sure why. But yes, their god is the trickster god, the mantis. kind of like how, is it Anansi, the spider, would be a trickster god for another region? Yeah, I found that interesting because their god they can talk to. He's right there with them.
Yeah, when it comes to like the healing songs and everything, they take equal weight in whether or not it's a traditional song or whether or not, one of them, spoke to their god in a dream, and in that dream they told them, hey, here's a new melody for a song. And so that's one of the reasons why it throws Western concepts of religion and everything, because on one hand they're like, no, this god is kind of an asshole and he's making us sick, but at the same time, like, he was also the one who gave us the power of healing and like teaches us how to do things. So there are no prayers within this group. Instead, whenever they tend to address God, it's usually like either yelling at him for doing something or like sternly asking him to do something for them. Like, hey, like you need to help out my brother because that's a good thing to do, and don't be a stingy dick about it. Like, you need to help us out. There's no like supplication or like groveling yourself before the god, but they'll take the information that's given to them by the god and be like, okay, let's see what use we can put to this.
They're also in conflict with God. They have a concept of the first disobedience, just like a lot of other religions do. God went off to do something, and God had a consort, his wife, and she died while he was away. And he told the humans not to bury her because he's coming back with the thing to resurrect her. They buried her anyway, and he denied us the gift of resurrection after that. So the conflict comes from this denied gift because we were disobedient and buried his wife. Right. Which goes back to the moon thing, because the moon is part of that resurrection cycle.
That also touches on, like, with their spirits of the dead and everything, they don't have ancestor veneration. They don't have, like, graveyards or a place where they can go and honor their dead. Basically, because when someone dies, they believe that, like, that person can either come back to help or come back to hurt you. And it's nice to, sort of honor the dead by naming new people after them. And that's what they do in order to, prevent this person from, being malevolent after they die. But it's not a guarantee. And so because it's not a guarantee, and this person could just as equally come back and be a total jerk to everyone else, like, they don't honor their dead. And they just, once someone dies, they're buried, and then they move on.
They move on to the stars. Mm-hmm. That's where they go. The stars, this is similar to the Australians in that there's the history, the ancestors, and the animal spirits are the stars. So when the soul moves on, it is a star up in the sky at that point. And that's where it would be, oh yeah, there's your uncle. But it wouldn't be, venerated. It was just a fact. Once it went to rest, it was up in the stars. Now, I can't tell you which book I got that from because I grabbed a whole bunch of other books too, trying to sort this shit out. But it was one of the accessory books that I'll put in the show notes somewhere.
The way that they approach their spiritual system and everything, I found immensely fascinating. There was also a tie-in that you had pointed out early on about how they had used their sweat as a kind of healing aspect, which was also similar to another group of Australian Aboriginal people.
Yeah, I did find that interesting, and that makes me wonder, because you wouldn't see the similarity. They are deeply divided in time. You wouldn't see the similarity unless it actually had purpose, popping up more than once. And I think we will probably run into it again in another arid group if we continue to look at arid groups. It makes me wonder, is there something there?
I think there
might
is.
Be.
And like, I had spent some time thinking about it, and it's somewhat used in like Western idioms where, we, especially within a lot of magical, like Western magical groups or whatever, like we have like blood magic and shit like that, or there's sexual fluids, but sweat tends to be overlooked a lot. However, like there is the Western idiom of, putting your blood, sweat, and tears into something. And especially amongst these arid groups, there's going to be that aspect of sweat because it's something that you are producing in this environment, and it is a bodily fluid that has a place, but it's not so much prevalent within Western society, except for like that one idiom, like you're putting your sweat into something.
It is also an ecosphere, and you are transmitting an ecosphere. So what could be contained in that could help someone else heal? There's going to be different fungus, different bacteria from different people. Your biome is not my biome. And I'm wondering if there is some legitimacy to the healing aspects of transferring sweat between two people, just as we do that with, what is it called? The fecal transplants. Yeah.
Which I think, and moving on, I think that, or to like the next sort of segment kind of thing, where I think that this is something that, we can adapt towards our own practices, and not necessarily the like swapping of sweat unless you're into that thing, but how with administrism, like with one of the tenets that we had put out early on, the idea of community, I think that it's necessary, and something that you should adapt into your practice is incorporating other people if you can. Like, work towards a common goal. Like, do something. Hell, even try out this ecstatic dance and get to that point where you are pushing that wall. I think that you should try and incorporate that aspect of sweat, because as I said, sweat is something that is kind of overlooked within, Western occultism. Like, what tends to be brought up, and there's that whole joke of, chaos magic, all you have to do is fucking jerk off on something and then the magic's done. Why not, work yourself up into a frenzy to the point where you are sweating, and use that sweat, because that in that instance is a present reminder of all of the energy. It's like the concentrated energy that you had put into something. Use that sweat and like use it for something.
Our next camp trip's going to get weird.
Hell yeah. But I think that's one of the practices that we can take away from this society that can be used in yours. And I think there are a lot of aspects from this society that can be used in our own, particularly with, their approach to, sharing and, community effort that's put into everything. We aren't an island. You have to understand that, everything you do with your group, if the energy you put into it is the energy that you get back. And I think that as far as occult practices, like, if I know some people don't have big groups that they can work with, but like there's usually someone or a couple people that you can. And I think that incorporating those aspects is something that should be brought into our practice. Experiment with the sweat. Experiment with those ecstatic states of dancing. I did also find it interesting that, there's with this group, they don't really have a divination system either. They don't really rely much on, and this kind of stems to their thing of, the existence is like a constant battle between us who are alive and those who are dead, or those spirits on the outside who are trying to encroach on our lives. And so we're trying to push them back and keep them away from us as much as we can, so that they don't, meddle too much in what we're doing. And so I feel like that's part of the reason why they don't really do much as far as divination, is because, you're trying to keep that aspect away. You're trying to keep the spiritual aspect away. So it's more of their ritual practices are pushing away the spiritual, so that way we have total agency over what we're doing. Like, we're not going to, request their benefit on other things. We're going to, make it so that what we're doing is totally ours.
There is a practice they have that does come close to divination. It's almost a proto divination.
Yeah.
It's the location of the next hunt. if there is a storm and lightning strikes, that is where you go to hunt. And that comes close to a divination.
Yeah, there was another one that was mentioned too, and it's also to locate the next hunt. If there hasn't been a storm, the anthropologists had suggested that this was a relatively new practice, like they hadn't been doing it much over the last, couple hundred years, but they would basically keep 6 leather discs in their pocket and then throw them on the ground and then interpret the direction of where those leather discs were telling them to go hunt.
Yeah, and as I said before, a lot of their religious practice has to do with either hunting or not getting eaten in the process. Something we didn't touch on is, because he didn't touch on it, is the why on a lot of their practice. So they practice polyrhythmic singing. The reason you would do that, especially on a new moon, is the lions can see you, but you can't see them. So to sound like more people than you actually have, you make sounds that would make a person sound like multiple people. And it was interesting that all of their songs would have this aspect to it to make it sound like there was way more there than what is.
Mm-hmm. And that was one thing that was mentioned by one anthropologist, saying that when you first listen to the music they make, it's like kind of off-putting. Like your brain can't really make up like what the hell's going on because of the polyrhythms. But then after you sit there for a while, it starts making more sense to you.
I do encourage you to go and find these musical tracks. They are available. I believe they are public access at this point, and just sit with them let them play all the way out and see how it changes in your mind and your perception as you go.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, that's the unless you had something else you wanted to say, I think we covered the Hoansi pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's all I have for today. My notes were real short for this one because the 3 books we read were the same book.
Yeah, kind of. They were either written by Richard Lee, or Richard Lee had something to do with it.
Yeah.
Like he was an editor or like an advisor or something. Like he had something to do with it.
Now, what practice for the home have you looked into this week?
So recently what I've been doing is I've been doing a lot of leatherworking. And I think that's something that people can pick up if they're interested in doing that. A lot of the leather that I have, I had picked up. I haven't gone to like a store to go get them. Most of the time, I've gotten leather from like Facebook Marketplace or like local advertisements. People just had leather sitting around, and I would just go buy it really cheap. And I've been using it in order to make things that I need around the house. Without, having to go out and buy unnecessary things. And these things are going to last a lot longer, especially if you manage to land like really thick 10-ounce leather. So like one of the things that I wanted, instead of going out and buying this tool belt made of all of these synthetic fibers and everything, I just made like a little tool pouch for myself that I could attach to my belt. And leatherworking it's very simple to get into. You don't need a whole lot of tools if you're going to start doing it. You need a sharp knife or scissors. You need a needle and thread. Usually, like, you'll want to get like waxed thread because that's really good at holding together, and the tensile strength of that shit is strong. You'll want some like leather needles, which are like normal needles, except the tip on them is blunted so that it can force through a lot easier. And then one thing that you can get to make the sewing a lot easier is getting an awl, which is just a spike with a handle on it. so that you can just punch those holes in. And that's really all you need. There are a lot of other tools that you can get, which I do have since like picking up leatherworking again. There are, skiving knives, which you can use to like thin out the leather. There are, bevelers, so that way you can round the edges. There are a lot of other tools. There's burnishing tools, which you need to go out of your way to get a burnishing tool. You just need, you could use a wooden handle on something. But I think being able to work with leather and make your own like durable products is something that's super useful and super sustainable, because as long as you take care of leather, it will last for decades. It will last for a very, very long time. And I think being able to use these natural, not fabrics, but these materials in order to, go through things, much like, glass over plastic for bottles. I think being able to do this is much more sustainable. And there are a lot of websites and people that can create patterns for you if you're into doing like making patterns for what you're trying to make, like, the tool pouch or belts or something like that. But you don't need them. You don't. Like, you're an intelligent human. You know what the shape of the thing needs to be. You know how a belt's shaped, right? It's a strip of leather with some holes in it. I made the sheath for one of my knives because the one that it came with was plastic, and it broke like the first weekend I got it when we were at Babylon Rising. The handle on it broke, the sheath. So I just made a new one because that knife was perfectly good. It's a great sharp knife. It just needed a sheath. I didn't use a pattern. I just laid it down on a piece of leather and used a pencil and traced out the shape of the knife, cut it out, and then stitched it together. I didn't need any special tool in order to do it, and you don't really need to either. Like I said, starting off, you need a sharp knife or scissors in order to cut through it, and you need a needle and thread.
Also, tie that back to the culture we're talking about today. They had some interesting relationships with animal skins.
Mm-hmm. Like, tools that they had was also a garment that was like the full thin, or the leather on this this animal was, I think it was the kudzu, was relatively thin, and so like they would use it sort of as a clothing item, and they would like drape it around their bottom half. But also, whenever they'd go out and gather magongo nuts, they would take that and throw it out and then use that to pile everything into in order to transport all of that.
Yeah, and that leather would be given as a gift sometimes between the groom and the bride, and it was referred to as the woman's satchel or something similar to that. It translates into the woman's object, and that was pretty much one of the only objects they would have outside of their active hunting instruments.
I've given leather gifts to friends. I've been doing a lot of leather working now, but prior to this, like, I had still done some. I had made like leather journals because those were relatively easy, and like I'd give those as gifts to people. Some people listening may have one of the leather journals that I had given you. Those were easy. It's a good gift. And like I said, with proper care and maintenance, a piece of leather will last a very, very long time. It can last decades. All you have to do is add some oil to it. There are a couple like specific kinds of oils that you can use. There's mink oil, there's neat's foot oil, which by adding that to the leather, it will soften it. It will preserve it. It will make it waterproof. And like, this will last for a very long time as long as you take care of it, as long as you treat it. Yeah, that's the at-home work. And there, just like with a lot of things, there are videos you can watch on YouTube. There are a lot of free resources out there. There are people who give classes on leatherworking. It's something that I'm getting better at. I've been able to like track what I've been making from the first thing I made, which was I made myself a wallet because my old one was falling apart, and this other one I got, or that I made, like, it's pretty crude, but it does its job. Like, it's not the best looking thing in the world, but it does its job, and that's what I needed it to do. But most recently, I made a hip pouch, and it's one that, like, it uses a belt to, like, attach to your thigh, and it looks a lot better. Like, objectively, it looks better. And so, like, yeah, that's, like, you'll get better with time, you'll get better with practice, but there are a lot of free resources out there, but it's a very simple and, satisfying hobby to partake in. So what plant do you have for us this episode?
Okay, it's kind of a cluster of plants. It is going to be your Datura and Brugmansia. Now, why I divide those, they used to be in the same group, they no longer are. They both have pretty much the same reason for usage. So your Daturas are in the Solanaceae group, which is your potatoes, tomatoes, and eggplants, but also Hyoscamus niger, which is your henbane, Atropa belladonna, which you know is belladonna, Mandragora officinarum, which is your mandrakes, and the Brugmansia, which is where scopolamine is usually harvested from. My current collection on these are the Jimson weed, the sacred Datura, and the Brugmansia. And all parts of these plants are poisonous. They all have scopolamine and atropine in them, so don't go putting them in your mouth unless you know what you're doing. Two of the ones I want to talk about are the ones that you will probably know the best. The Stramonium, which is your Jimson weed, was used in North American traditions for initiations and for spiritual practices, mostly by using their seeds in a brew. These can be traced from basically central Mexico all the way up to north of Pennsylvania, because it grows north of here. And it was here when the Europeans decided to take over. And it's considered a weed here, a noxious weed here, and it's technically not native to here. So how did it get here? It was moved on trade lines, which means anytime someone encountered this plant, they loved it. And they used it and they propagated it. Now, why would they go and use this thing? Let me tell you, this thing is not fun to play with. This is not your good time drug plant. This is a bad time drug plant. And the problem with that is they are highly useful when doing a spiritual practice where the user of this item is very well versed in this item. It's very powerful and they can get a lot from it. People who are being initiated into it do not have a good time. They get to spend weeks in a delirious state, sometimes locked in a cage. And if you tried to do this, that is your fate. You will get locked in a cage until it burns out of your system. It is a very long-lasting entheogen. It would have been smoked, but it also had other properties. You can make a salve out of it. And if you were to use it, I would say use this method. Make a salve out of the leaves. It has healing properties. One of the other ones is Datura mattel, which is in the plant trade. It's going to look very similar to the Stramonium, to the Jimson weed, only it's going to be purple. And it's thought to have been from India. It is not. This plant gets so weird. It probably started in the Americas in the 4th century, and nobody can find its wild ancestors. You would think if you found it in the wild, you have its wild ancestor. You do not. You have a cultivated product, a cultivated plant that's been cultivated for a very long time. The way they know it was cultivated is it has the phenomenon of seed retention, which is not a thing that wild plants do. Seed retention is done for seed harvesting and is considered part of the syndrome of domestication in plants, just like having floppy ears on a dog or on a rabbit is a syndrome of domestication. Seed retention is a form of domestication in plants. The weird thing is, how did it get to India from Central America? No one's entirely sure. It appears in the Vedic period when India takes on and develops its traditions that we see today. It is part of the worship of Shiva and is considered very essential to their worldview, their cosmic worldview. And in their tradition, there was a battle between everything that was before we were humans. Shiva went to this boiling ocean that was poisonous and sucked out all the poison, which will appear in his drawings as a blue lump in his neck, which is representative of that plant. That's how long that has been there. It has also been found in Africa on the eastern side of Africa, which means it came from Mexico to Asia to Africa, and it retains its spiritual usages all the way through. It's very odd. It's used in the divine and occult insanity practices, so your delirious states, and it's used as initiations in Africa. Now, this begs the question, how did it go from America to Asia? There are a few plants that go back and forth between those groups, and nobody has the evidence yet of how this happened. But there was a pre-Columbian exchange between Asia and South America and Mexico at some point, but no one can pin down when or how it happened because the Pacific Ocean is a motherfucker to get across. So these plants, they have been with us for a very long time, apparently, and they seem to be pushing their own path across the world for no other obvious purpose than to make us crazy when we encounter them. I found this amazing. I don't think other people are going to find it as amazing as I do, but
well, I know that
it's displaying domestication.
Yeah, and I know that another plant that is believed to have had pre-Columbian trade between South America and the Pacific is the sweet potato. And we believe this because of the word used by Pacific Islanders for the sweet potato is very close to what the word is amongst indigenous South American people.
And it's even more complex than that, because the sweet potato and the Datura Mattel come from a jungle environment, which means they had to cross the Andes to get to the next coast and then make that big journey across the Pacific Ocean. We have a lot of things pointing to this happening, but we have no proof of it happening other than that. So, yeah, Daturas, if you choose to use them, be ready to go to jail because you're going to go crazy for a little bit unless you've been doing it for a while. As I said, it's related to your henbanes and will serve the same purposes as them, the belladonna and the mandrake, if you're doing these herbal practices, maybe in North America. So you don't have to go and get a plant from another country. We have it right here.
And it should be iterated that, yes, they are used entheogenically, but understand that they are toxic and can kill you dead.
They will kill you. Yes, they absolutely can.
Yeah, that should be reiterated. Like, I don't want anyone fucking killing themselves dead over these plants. So take that into account.
Yep. Okay, that's all from me.
Yep, and that's all I've got for this episode. For the next one, we have already decided on the group that we will be covering. We will be looking at the Matsuganka of the Peruvian Amazon. The Matsuganka are a tribe of people that are kind of lumped in with the Arawak language group. And so there are a lot of other similar indigenous people that live or that are kind of like lumped in with them. But yeah, Peruvian Amazon for the next one.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. This has been another fun-ass time, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as we did learning from it, and hope that you can take something from it for your own practice. And as always, we will be posting all of the sources that we used for this on the various platforms, and for you to look in further if this is something you are interested in. Thank you.
Thank you. Fuck yeah.
Hey, guy, my field's anthropology.
Well, good luck with the job hunt.
Right? Not that it's any of your business, but I plan to teach.
Anthropology.
What? Yes!
To anthropology major?
Hey, you know what?
That's continuing the circle of why bother?
Oh, anthropology is a very important field of study.
I'm pretty sure somebody's already named all the different spiders now.
That's arachnology.
I know. Equally huge waste of time.